Good afternoon. Welcome to NCG's 2020 virtual conference. There are over 300 of our community together today. This is a heavy week. We appreciate you being here with us. I'm Philanthropy Kwok, the acting co-CEO at NCG.
And I'm Steve Barton. I'm the other acting co-CEO at NCG. As we're all sheltering in place and wondering what this world is going to look like on the other side of this pandemic, we're also seeing police violence, the continuing devaluation of Black lives, and protests taking place across the country and impacting communities in our own backyard as we stand in this important moment of inclusive democracy.
Minnesota is where I grew up, and it's where I call home, and seeing it on fire night after night has been devastating and has made me really rethink the theme of our conference, love. How do we show up for love for each other right now when there's so much hurt and rage? How do we demonstrate love and philanthropy? And what's our responsibility as individuals and collectively as a sector?
And for NCG, this is a time for us to support philanthropy, to lead on equity and address systemic racism, to champion justice, unity, and the common good. In this pandemic, communities of color and immigrant communities are being hit the hardest. In order to rebuild, we will need to focus on racial equity and social justice. The moment is now. We can reinvent our institutions. We can reinvent our economy in a manner that creates opportunity and addresses the inequities we've seen across the board. We can reduce poverty and we can expand prosperity.
Steve and I started as acting co-CEO around the same time we were all ordered to shelter in place. It has been the most interesting way to start in our new roles. And in the past 3 months, like many of you, we've pivoted our work. Since early March, NCG has hosted over 50 COVID-19 related programs, providing information, resources, and connection to our members.
We worked with our partners in LA and San Diego to deliver our first ever statewide policy summit in April, which highlighted so many of the issues we're facing in this moment. Our programs are helping build understanding about how to move forward together, even as we're physically distant, based on how the world is changing and what we all need.
We applaud all of you who've been so quick to pivot in your work towards the hardest hit and towards a long view towards recovery, knowing that this is a marathon. For all of us, this means focusing our energies towards a more equitable and just world. In other words, focusing our work on love. And with that, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on. We invite you to click on the native land map in your chat box now. Please share your name, organization, and the name of the native land and the people where you are today. I am speaking to all of you from my home in Alameda, and I'm on Ohlone land.
We also want to thank all our sponsors and a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, the Stupski Foundation.
We have an amazing lineup for you today, starting with our keynote, Valarie Kaur, a civil rights activist, attorney, and the founder of the Revolutionary Love Project. Following her remarks, we'll break into small group discussion and then a panel conversation on how to lead with love. Please join us on Twitter at #TogetherApart.
Thank you. We really appreciate you being here today with all of us and with your community. Now let's get started.
I am now pleased to welcome Valarie Kaur. I knew I wanted to bring Valarie and her work, the Revolutionary Love Project, to our community the moment I met her last fall. She's a seasoned civil rights activist, an award-winning filmmaker, an attorney, a faith leader, and she's launching her new book, See No Stranger, later this month. She's fierce and she's brave. She has a powerful message to share with all of us today. And as you listen, please continue to submit your questions in the Q&A. With that, please join me in welcoming Valarie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Fung. Thank you so much, Northern California grantmakers, for convening us today around the question of love in a time such as this. I'm speaking to you right now live from Los Angeles, and I need to tell you where I am and where my body is in this moment. There are helicopters circling overhead. There are sirens sounding in the distance. My heart is soaring as I'm hearing from friends who are texting me about their protesting peacefully in the streets. And at the same time, I know that the National Guard is posted on the streets around my son's preschool. And I am at home with my 2 small children. A few minutes ago, there was a man yelling in our street outside of our house, declaring that he is heavily armed and threatening violence. So my husband is vigilant right now. So if my voice shakes, it is because I am having a human experience about how to keep my brown children safe in the face of an increasingly militarized police presence. even as I am trying to show up in this work. And so I want to name that each of you are having a human experience right now, trying to keep those you are responsible for safe from the pandemic and from state violence, even as you are trying to show up in the work. Each of you are carrying a heavy load that only you know, just to make it through each hour. And yet you are here. You are sitting here, connecting through the screen, and in doing so, you are recommitting yourself to the community that you are part of. You became a change maker for a reason. You became a grant maker for a reason. You were made for a time such as this. You are mustering the energy and the courage to reflect, even as we are all living history in real time. So I see you. I see you, and I thank you for being here. And so before we begin, I thought it was important to ask us to breathe together, to arrive into our bodies before I talk about how we might push together. Are you ready? I want to invite you to place your feet on the floor, and you can lay your palms on your lap. You can have them face up or face down. And you can sit back from the screen for just a moment and lower your eyes or close your eyes. Good. Let's take 3 deep breaths together. Let it come. Let it go. And let it come. And let it go. Without judging or forcing or struggling, just letting the breath move through you, letting your body do what your body knows how to do. Let it come. And let it go. Good. Now I invite you to notice what your body feels like today. What sensations you notice in your body. Just doing a scan with your attention, running your attention down the length of your body, letting your attention be as light as a feather. Let it be that light. Checking, just noticing your head, the space behind your eyes, your jaw, the saliva in your mouth, what you were holding in your shoulders, in your shoulder blades. Where is your breath in your body, in your chest? Notice your belly. Notice your pelvic floor, the bowl of your pelvic floor. Are you sitting in your body right now? Good. As you're running attention down the length of your spine, remembering that feather, let it be that light, just noticing what sensations, where you feel heaviness, where you feel ease. Gathering information as you're running your attention down your right leg, and then your left leg, your right arm, and then your left arm. All the way down as you notice what it feels like for your feet to touch the earth. Notice the difference between holding yourself up and letting the earth hold you up. Good. Take another deep inhale with me. Let it come. Let it go. And now I invite you to hold in your mind's eye a visual map of your body, almost as if you've collected information about the sensations that you were holding inside of your body. If you could give a name to the bundle of sensations, a name of an emotion, what would it be? Are you feeling grief or fatigue or ease or fear or a number of those? Just get curious. Good. I invite you to place your hand on your heart now and just noticing that you are here. You are alive. You are safe enough in this moment to hear these words and to feel this. You are brave enough to feel what your body is feeling. And in this moment, it's okay to let yourself feel it. Good. I like to imagine that anytime we are entering a ritual moment or creating a sacred moment of reflection, our ancestors lift their heads. So I invite you now to be curious about which ancestor you might want to call forth in this moment. Many of you named your indigenous ancestors of this land in the chat. So is it someone from history? Is it someone from your family line? Is it a grandparent? Who is it who's coming forth in this moment? Someone that you need. I invite you to choose someone who knew something of bravery. Good. Now I want you to imagine this ancestor standing behind you gently with compassion, maybe even a hand on your shoulder or at your back. And as we take 3 deep breaths together, just notice what it feels like not to be alone, to have this ancestor at your back, making you brave. Let it come. Let it go. And as you breathe in, let in whatever it is that you wish to receive from them. Let it come. Let it go. And one more time, let it come. And let it go. Good. And just noticing this moment, how your body feels. And if you have a question that you wish to ask that ancestor, ask it now. Just listen for what happens. Good. Hold on to what you hear. I invite you to take what you hear and just whisper it into your own palm. And then place it into your heart as if you're taking that message into your body. And if you heard nothing at all, that's okay. If it was just a feeling, just take that and put it into your own body, knowing that you can always come back here to this feeling, this knowledge, this wisdom that you are not alone. And as you slowly come back to the room, you can slowly lift your eyes and come back to the space that we're holding together. I invite you to imagine that you carry in your body and being and breath the memory of ancestors, blood or not, who have endured great atrocities and survived. And if we inherit intergenerational trauma, then I believe that we inherit intergenerational wisdom too. Good. So I invite you to shake or stretch. Notice what it feels like to be fully here, fully arriving, fully receiving what it is that my heart wishes to put in your heart. Are you ready? My sisters, my brothers, my siblings, we are in the midst of an uprising that is unprecedented in our nation's history. Today is the 9th day of protests since George Floyd's murder. There are millions of people flooding our streets across America and around the globe amid a global pandemic, risking their own lives in their grief and their rage and despair and hope in defense of Black lives. And we also know, as we're witnessing this groundswell that we've never seen before, that we've never been part of before in our living memory, we also know that in response to protests over police brutality, we are seeing police brutality. We are seeing the tear gas and batons and the flash grenades. And on Monday night, the President of the United States vowed to deploy his own military on his own people, then walked through a park where government forces used tear gas and flash grenades on demonstrators to clear his path in order to stand in front of a church and hold up a Bible. These are scenes of an America that we never thought we would witness. I never thought I would witness in my own lifetime, even as the dying words of George Floyd are still echoing in our ears. Please, as he called for his mother, I can't breathe. Even as we are reeling from 100,000 deaths in a pandemic that is disproportionately killing Black people. Here we are in this unprecedented moment in history, as we are living it in real time, having the audacity to convene around the question of love. What does revolutionary love look like now? Revolutionary love is when you are brave enough to see no stranger. And that means George Floyd and Tony McDade are our brothers, and Breonna Taylor is our sister, and every Black person who is suffering or sick or poor or dying in America is part of our own family, even in this breathless moment when our streets look like battlefields and our president behaves as a dictator. We are called to summon our deepest bravery to continue to rise up, to continue this uprising, to continue to breathe and push and to see where it might arrive us. And I believe that each of us has different roles in this moment, different roles in the labor. And so to those of you who are listening, to my Black sisters and brothers and siblings, I want to say to you that we witness the pain you are feeling in your body, the grief and the rage and the fear and the numbness, because you are just so tired. Those of us who are not Black cannot exactly feel what you are feeling, but we can sit in this darkness with you and take your hand and say to you, you are grieving, but you do not grieve alone. This moment may feel like what your parents and grandparents had to fight. But something new is happening, and I really want you to know this, that there are more of us with you now than ever before, more than in 1968, more than in 1992. Never before have so many non-Black people of color and white allies and local leaders exercised their voices to say that your lives matter. We are calling out the centrality of anti-Black racism in America, how it has not only seized our hearts, but ordered our institutions of power. And I don't know where this will lead, but I do know that we are rising up with you. And that means that you do not need to do all the labor alone, not anymore. May you take time to breathe and to rest and take care of your own body, your children, and your families. Your revolutionary act is to love yourselves in a time the world wants to make you strange to yourself. So I ask you to trust this, to allow yourself to breathe before the next push. To those of you who are listening, who are people of color, who are not Black, especially my Asian American family, this is a moment to show up for the Black people in our lives like never before. Like they are our aunties and uncles and parents and babies. Our civil rights were won by Black communities, and yet we have let ourselves believe that anti-Black racism is the problem of white and Black people. How often have our communities been complicit in the anti-Black oppression, in the slang we use at the kitchen table, or the privileges that we hold? But we are also survivors of hate violence and white supremacy. And we know what it is like to be left alone with our grief. And so we have a choice. Are we like Officer Thao, standing by, following the rules, keeping our heads down while we allow Black people behind us to die? Or are we what our great spiritual teachers and wisest ancestors dreamed for us? Are we agents of revolutionary love? And to those of you who are listening, who are our white allies, I ask you now to be more than allies. We ask you to be accomplices and to conspire with us to break chains of oppression. Our nation's legacy of racism is not your fault, but you have inherited a nation designed to benefit you. America's social, political, and economic institutions run on the assumption that Black bodies are disposable and depend on your failure of imagination for you to not even see the ways that you are seeing those of us who are brown or Black or Indigenous as less than you. That means that we alone cannot solve the problem of racism, but you can. I know it feels like this crisis is new, but each of us in this moment has a role in this labor because we can look to the stories of our ancestors on how they showed up in this moment. This moment calls for acts of love and solidarity, revolutionary love. And so as we closed our eyes and imagined our ancestors, I want to share with you a story of solidarity from my ancestry that has brought me to you today. It starts with my own grandfather and shows me how to stand up for Black lives now. It is a story of revolutionary love. Are you ready? So my grandfather was 20 years old when he sailed by steamship from India to California more than a century ago in the year 1913. His ship landed at Angel Island off the coast of San Francisco, but when he presented his British Indian passport, he was dragged into a cell and locked inside. You see, this was a time not unlike the one we are in of violent white nativist forces, and immigration officials at Angel Island were determined to deport as many Asian laborers as possible. Ellis Island was a symbol of welcome for European immigrants. Angel Island was a symbol of exclusion for us. My grandfather languished in that cell for 3 months. He would have been deported. I wouldn't be here. If it weren't for a single man, a lawyer, a white man named Henry Marshall, who saw my grandfather, his beard and his tall turban, and decided to see him not as a stranger, but as a brother, as an equal, he filed a writ of habeas corpus, and my grandfather was set free on Christmas Eve, 1913. My grandfather became a farm worker, sleeping in barns at night in California's Central Valley, twisting his body in crates to keep safe from the snakes. He survived the 1918 Spanish flu and was part of a generation of advocates who joined forces with other immigrant communities, other immigrant laborers, to end racist laws that prevented them from becoming citizens or owning property or making a life. Fast forward. When my grandfather saw his Japanese American neighbors rounded up and forced into camps into the punishing deserts of Arizona during World War II, he looked after their farms that would otherwise be pillaged and ransacked and emptied so that they would have a life to return to. He went to visit them when no one else would. He brought back a rock on one of those visits, a petrified rock from the Arizonan desert that my father then grew up with and that I then grew up with on my family's mantelpiece. And now my son and my daughter are growing up with this rock that they can hold and touch and remember what it means to be as brave as my grandfather. I grew up on the land that my grandfather farmed. And I remember my best friend growing up was a granddaughter of one of those Japanese American families, Bryn Saito. And we would sit in a car in the parking lot of my high school and watch the sun set over the orchards and wondered what it meant to be as brave as our ancestors. Fast forward, in the aftermath of September 11th, in the aftermath of that horror when hate violence swept the city streets of America and Muslim Americans and Sikh Americans who are not Muslim but stand with our Muslim brothers and sisters, when we were the ones being targeted. A Sikh man I called Uncle Balbir Singh Sodhi was the first person to be murdered in a hate crime. And I became an activist and spent the next days and weeks and months and years struggling to tell his story. And in my darkest moments, it was Bryn who believed in me, who stood by me, just as the Japanese American community was standing by our communities. And when hate violence was soon followed by state violence, I stumbled into Bryn's apartment one night after being assaulted by a police officer, having suffered nerve damage that would take me years to heal. And I cried and I cried, and it was Bryn who put a blanket around my shoulders and fed me soup and said that we were still on the quest to be as brave as our ancestors. 15 years later, just a few weeks ago, Bryn told me that she was staying inside the house because she is more afraid of hate outside her home instead of the virus. And I knew that there have been 1,500 hate incidents against Asian Americans in the course of the last month. And I told her, oh, my love, you are not alone. I'm here just as you were here for me. Ancestral Solidarity, she called it. And I thought of my grandfather and the white man who freed him and saved his future, and how he cared for his Japanese American neighbors and saved their future, and how one of their granddaughters was caring for me to save my future, and now how I am trying to care for her and save her future. And now both of us are doing the work of waking up our communities to the responsibility of caring and fighting for our Black sisters and brothers and siblings in our lives. Ancestral solidarity. US history is littered with atrocities, from genocide to slavery to segregation to modern day state violence and hate violence. But if you look close enough, you will see that there have always been people who crossed the line and chose to love people they would have otherwise seen as strangers. They rushed in to cut down the lynching noose. They showed up at the memorials to say, "Not in my name." They shared in each other's grief, and in so doing, they also shared with one another's joy. We see this now as I see my white friends putting their bodies in front of their Black friends, kneeling down in front of an army of police officers. That's what it looks like when we choose to love beyond what evolution requires. Love becomes revolutionary. And revolutionary love is the choice to be brave enough to see no stranger, to labor for each other, to bleed for one another, to fight for one another, not out of obligation, but out of love. When I was a little girl, I always thought of the story of America as a story of linear progress. My grandfather sacrificed so that we could live free, and I would fight and the next generation would be freer still. But what of linear progress now? When the darkness has grown so thick around us, when our cities are on fire, when Black people are more in danger than their ancestors were, when my son is growing up in a nation more dangerous for him than it was for me as a brown child. If we take a linear view of history now, then we are sliding back into darkness. But I ask you this, especially those of you who are feeling hopeless right now, I ask you this: what if we see the story of America as one long labor? Progress during birthing labor is cyclical, not linear. It is a series of expansions and contractions, and each turn through the cycle brings us closer to what is being born. I see this pattern through US history. A generation fought to abolish slavery and free people from bondage, but it was followed by Jim Crow. Another generation fought to build a civil rights movement to end segregation and win equal rights, but it was followed by criminal justice, immigration, and national security systems that continued to punish Black and brown people. The labor is ongoing, right? 68, 92, 2020. The labor is ongoing. The injustice relentless. It may seem like we've made no progress, but I want you to see this. Each time people organized, each turn through the cycle opened a little bit more space for equality and justice and solidarity. It also created ancestral memory. We carry the memory of the movements that came before us. Like the body in labor, we have gained more embodied knowledge about what to do when the contractions come. The pandemic is new, but the pattern of injustices is not. We can still turn to the wisdom of our ancestors for how to labor. I think of the lawyer who freed my grandfather, the farmer who cared for Japanese American neighbors, the granddaughter who cared for me, I who care for her, we who are showing up to center Black lives. How are you inheriting stories of revolutionary love that make you brave enough to push in ways that you haven't pushed before? You see, each act of revolutionary love not only saved my future, saved our futures, it expanded what was possible. It brings us closer, it has brought us closer to the world that we are longing for, a world where we see and protect the dignity and the wellness and the flourishing of each and every one of us. And so I want to present to you this question I have asked myself every day, especially now. Is this darkness in our nation and our world the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? It is both. It is both. Something is dying in our nation so that something new can be born. Even amid this mass suffering and death, I see glimpses of the world that is longing to be born, don't you? I believe that we have a chance now, in this moment of crisis and contraction and transition, that we have a chance now, like never before, to begin to transition our society if we stay in the labor. If we stay in the labor. And that brings me to love, revolutionary love. Revolutionary love is how we birth the world to come. And this brings me to you. You are the change makers and the grant makers. You are here because you believe in leveraging your talent and your skill and your access to resources to bringing about racial and economic and social justice. And that means that you are the midwives in this time of great transition. Philanthropy. Philanthropy means love of humanity. The choices you make now, how you choose to love humanity as an individual, but as part of the institutions that you steer right now, the choices that you make for how to love will determine our collective future. So this is what I want to equip you with. Revolutionary love requires revolutionary language. So here's mine. Here are my definitions. Love is more than a rush of feeling. Love is labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, life-giving, a choice we make again and again and again. Love as labor can be taught. Love can be modeled. Love can be practiced. And so love is not any one feeling. Love engages all of our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Rage protects that which is loved. Wonder returns us to love. Revolutionary love is the choice to enter into this labor for others, for even our opponents, and for ourselves. And revolutionary love, to be practiced in these three different ways, can only be practiced in community. Some of us do the labor of loving ourselves, while others can reach out to opponents that we cannot, while others still are standing in solidarity. That's what it means to be part of a community, part of a movement, part of sharing the labor of love in these three directions. After the last presidential election, I had a moment of existential crisis, and I had a gift that few women who are mothers and activists have, time to think, a room of my own. And I spent a year and the last several years pouring through social movements of the past, pouring through wisdom traditions, pouring through my own stories of frontlines activism and the science of human behavior. I sat at my desk every day. I moved my family to a part of the rainforest in Central America where I could be quiet and we could be safe. And as the mist drifted through the Green Valley, I was reading and pouring through these texts. I had a ground team back in the United States, a team of researchers from the fields of ethics, education, conflict and resolution, and neuroscience. And as I was looking through their memos and looking through my stories, I began to see patterns. We identified 10 core practices of revolutionary love, 10 core practices that are in this book, See No Stranger, that comes out in 12 days on June 16th. These are the 10 practices: wonder, grieve, fight, rage, listen, reimagine, breathe, push, transition, and joy. Our vision in this work is to equip our movements with this framework, put this book and put these tools in the hands of educators and faith leaders and families and activists who are on the front lines right now. Because I believe if we're not laboring in love, we will not last, we will get sick, we will die, we will give up, we will go numb. But if we teach our younger generation, especially what it means to labor in love like our ancestors did in the past, and they will last. I want them to grow old. I want to grow old. I want to grow old with you. I want to last. And the only way we will last, I wrote this book for my own survival and for yours, the only way we will last is if we are rooting our justice work, if we're rooting our struggle in the practice of love. And so to finish here, I want to give you 3 practices. I wish I could just spend another hour and give you all 10 of them, but I'm going to give you 3 practices here that I think would be especially useful in the world of philanthropy. So I have to take 5 minutes to give you these 3 practices so you can really dig into them when you break into your small groups. What does revolutionary love mean for the world of philanthropy? First, I believe, and this is coming from my life as an activist, as a woman of color, and as someone who's thought a lot about what it means to labor and love in the work of justice. These are the 3. First, we need to move beyond resistance to reimagining the world that ought to be. Find and fund projects led by people of color who are reimagining the institutions that order our society. For example, in 2009, I was part of a coalition of community members, lawyers, and faith leaders who successfully transformed a police department that was accused and guilty of a pattern and practice of racial profiling that had killed a young Black man, Malik Jones, in the 1990s, and was engaging in excessive use of force and violence against Latinx community members. We sat in a church basement, and the priest asked the community, who has the power in this land, in this town? And they said, the police, the mayor. And then someone said, the people. And the priest drew a line on a piece of paper, the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. And he invited the community members along with the lawyers to imagine what a police department that actually protected their public safety would look like, would feel like, would be like. And we launched a 3-year campaign, and you know what happened? We had the federal government involved and the Department of Justice involved. And it, through tireless work and tireless advocacy and using all the tools in our kit, we achieved a monumental consent decree that met the demands that were imagined in that church basement. Today, the East Haven Community Police Department is not perfect, but the community had ended its reign of terror and had not just resisted, it had reimagined the police department and policing into something new. Now, of course, one police department is not enough. What would it mean for philanthropy to invest in those of us, part of communities of color, to reimagine what public safety looks like, what policing looks like? We're in such crisis response mode all the time that if we have enough investment to have that time and space to think and reimagine and translate those demands and work with those who can make those demands possible, that is how we are given the power to shift and transition our institutions. So number 1 is reimagine, investing in reimagining. Number 2, grieving is frontline social justice work. Find and fund the work that brings people together to grieve, to rage, to weep, to lament in community and in ritual. When people who have no other reason to love each other come together to grieve with one another, they come to know one another, and they gain the information they need to fight with one another. I know this because I remember my experience in 2012 in the wake of the mass shooting by a white supremacist in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, that killed ultimately 7 members of my community. The Sikh community has rituals for grief, has containers for grief, and we invited our interfaith partners all around the nation and in Milwaukee to come together to grieve with us through ritual and through ceremony, and new relationships were formed, were built, new bonds were made, and so that we could then say, well, now fight with us. Fight for us and alongside us. And after a year of fighting, we were able to, in the name of all those who were killed, do something that we had been fighting to do for a decade, which is to ask the federal government to track hate crimes against our community. It weren't even being tracked. How can we measure, how can we solve a problem that we're not even measuring? Today, the federal government does track hate crimes against our communities and other minority communities. That only happened because there were more people by our side raising our voices. If it was just alone, it was falling on deaf ears. But those who came with us to grieve with us then had the ability to show up, to fight with us for social and political and policy change. And so investing in those containers to grieve is how we build the capacity of social movements that are not rooted in obligation or duty, but rooted in love. Number 3, we need time and space to breathe. I say this as a woman of color. Find and fund projects that center the healing and the resilience of frontline activists. I have been in crisis response mode since September 11th, alongside a generation of Muslim and Sikh activists who have been funded for crisis response work. We built institutions designed for crisis response work. We got trained for crisis response work. We continued to get funded for crisis response work. But crisis response alone continues to frame us as victims who are trying to survive, not as people who have vision to offer the nation about where we need to go next. So I ask you to fund us so that we have time and space, not to resist and not just to respond to crisis, but to breathe. In order to do the work of reimagining, we need to be breathing ourselves. And so I say this because the book Advance that I received gave me the ability to create this entire framework of revolutionary love. We now have a book, a curriculum, a network, a coalition, and deep clarity about how to make change and who to make it with and what to do next, and we are barely funded. How many of your dollars are going into institutions run by white leaders versus frontline communities of color, frontline people of color who also have something to offer about how to transition the nation? I see other projects with similar visions that don't have enough, organizations like Dream Corps who are imagining the nation to come. This crisis that we're in is not just political or economic or social. This is a spiritual and cultural crisis, and we need cultural and spiritual interventions. We need to fund cultural and spiritual solutions. We can no longer do that work uncompensated. I've been struggling for funds my entire life. How many activists are like me? We need you to see our work as essential for the future. We are telling the story of the America that could be. This is what I could do as an individual. Imagine a whole cohort of activists and visionaries who in this moment, even in this moment of crisis and breathlessness, if you give us the support to be breathing right now, then we can be stepping into designing the long-term solutions that we know we need because it lives in our bodies. We can draw from that wisdom of our lived experience to reimagine the world to come. So those are the 3 that I offer you: moving from resistance to reimagination, funding front lines, grieving work, healing work, resilience work, and finally giving those of us who are on the front lines time and space to breathe, to envision, and to reimagine. This is how I ask you to fund the revolution. I want to leave you with that image of the birthing metaphor. Remember that labor and birth is cyclical. At this moment in history, we are always in a different place in the cycle. And your place in the cycle, you may be seeing around you the earliest stages of a movement taking form. This is from my book, The First Posts and Protests and Partnerships. Or we may be seeing the president's pen on a civil rights bill. Often when we bear witness to the first, we will not be in the room for the second. I invite you to take the long view. The labor of revolution can be longer than a lifetime. What matters is the choice to show up to the labor in front of you with the specific gifts you have been given to play your particular role. When we labor in love, we not only make future victories possible, we also begin to transform the world within us and around us here and now. And so I leave you with the words of the midwife. This will be one long labor, so breathe and push, my love. Breathe and push. For we will be someone else's ancestors one day. And if we get this right, they will inherit not our fear, but our bravery.